The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth as I stepped out of the car. Blackthorn Memorial Facility loomed ahead, its gray stone facade stark against the backdrop of dense, shadowy forest. The building was larger than I'd imagined, its sharp angles and narrow windows giving it an austere presence. I adjusted the strap of my bag over my shoulder and took a deep breath. This was it. My first day. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I approached the entrance. The glass doors slid open with a faint hiss, and I was greeted by a blast of cold, sterile air. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow over the polished floors and stark white walls. The reception desk was empty, save for a small brass bell and a clipboard with a neatly printed schedule. I hesitated for a moment, glancing around the quiet lobby, before the sound of brisk footsteps drew my attention. "Miss Clara, I presume?" The voice was sharp and carried an air of authority. I turned to see Mr. Hargrove approaching, his thin frame cutting a precise figure in his dark suit. He extended a hand, his grip firm and dry when I shook it. "Yes, that's me," I said, my voice steady. "Good. Punctuality is important here," he said. "Follow me." Without waiting for a response, he turned and began walking briskly down the hallway. I hurried to keep up, the soles of my boots squeaking faintly against the polished floor. "This facility," Mr. Hargrove began, his voice measured, "is one of the most advanced in the region. We handle everything here with precision and care. I expect the same from you." I nodded, though he wasn't looking at me. His pace was unrelenting as he led me through the labyrinth of hallways, pointing out various rooms and their functions with practiced efficiency. The embalming room smelled faintly of chemicals. The viewing rooms, stark and impersonal, were designed to be comforting but felt anything but. Each space was cold and clinical. As we walked, Mr. Hargrove's tone remained even. He spoke of procedures and protocols, of respect and discretion, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something unspoken. We stopped in front of a heavy steel door marked Unit 7. The air here felt colder, the hum of the cooling units louder. Mr. Hargrove turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "This," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "is Unit 7. You'll be responsible for ensuring it remains locked at all times, 3 times to be exact." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. 3 times? "Yes," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Always 3, no exceptions." There was a pause. His eyes bore into mine, as if willing me to understand something he wasn't saying. I nodded slowly. "Understood," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I did. "Good," he said, his faint smile returning. "Let's continue." The rest of the tour passed in a blur as he explained the intricacies of the facility. By the time we returned to the lobby, Mr. Hargrove handed me a neatly typed schedule and a set of keys. "You'll start tomorrow at 6 sharp, he said. "I trust you'll be prepared." "Yes, of course," I said, clutching the keys tightly in my hand. He nodded once, then turned and disappeared down the hallway without another word. I stood there for a moment, the keys cold in my hand. As I made my way back to the car, the image of Unit 7 lingered in my mind. The forest seemed darker as I drove away, the dense trees pressing in on either side of the road. I told myself it was just a door, just a job. But the unease coiled in my stomach refused to be dismissed. The keys felt no lighter in my hand as the days passed, their cold weight a constant reminder of the responsibility I'd taken on. My first few shifts at Blackthorn Memorial Facility were uneventful. I spent my days moving between the embalming room, the viewing areas, and the cold storage units. The sterile scent of disinfectant and the faint hum of the cooling units became familiar. Evenings were spent cataloging paperwork, preparing bodies for transport, and scrubbing every surface until it gleamed. The work was methodical, repetitive, leaving little room for wandering thoughts. I'd grown used to the stillness, to the way the building seemed to hold its breath around me. After several days of this, my schedule shifted, and I was assigned my first night shift. Mr. Hargrove met me at the start of the shift. He handed me the keys with his usual briskness. "The night is when the building feels alive," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Stick to your tasks, and don't wander." I raised an eyebrow, unsure whether he was being serious or simply indulging in his usual cryptic manner. His expression gave nothing away. "And remember, Unit 7. I nodded, slipping the keys into my pocket. Of course. His gaze lingered on me for a moment longer, as though searching for something. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance. The first few hours passed quietly. I moved through my tasks with practiced efficiency. The embalming room was spotless by the time I finished, the instruments gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. The paperwork was tedious but straightforward, the neat columns of names and dates blurring together as the hours ticked by. It wasn't until just past midnight that I noticed it. The air. It felt heavier somehow, pressing against my skin like an unseen weight. The silence now seemed too deep, too absolute. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was nothing. Then I heard it, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, echoing down the hallway. I froze, my pen hovering above the page I'd been writing on. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again. Tap, 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 soft but insistent, like someone knocking on a distant door. I set the pen down carefully, the sound of it clicking against the desk louder than it should have been. I stood, the tapping growing louder with each step I took toward the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, their cold glow casting long, sharp shadows along the walls. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the cold storage units. My footsteps echoed in the empty corridor, the tapping growing louder and more distinct as I approached. It wasn't frantic or erratic. It was measured, deliberate, as though whoever, or whatever, was making it wanted to be heard. I stopped in front of Unit 7, the cold air from the cooling units brushing against my skin. The door loomed before me, its steel surface dull and unyielding. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the lock, the keys clinking softly as I pulled them from my pocket. 3 times, always 3. I checked the lock once, tugging it firmly to ensure it was secure. The tapping continued, steady and unrelenting. I checked it a second time, as the sound seemed to grow louder, more insistent. Finally, I checked it a 3rd time, my fingers brushing against the cold steel, as I pulled at the lock with all my strength. It didn't budge. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I stood there for a moment, the keys still clutched tightly in my hand. The air felt colder now, the chill seeping into my bones. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the empty hallway. That's when I felt it. A presence. It was intangible, impossible to define, but it was there. Watching. Waiting. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I forced myself to take a step forward, then another, my movements stiff and mechanical. The oppressive weight of unseen eyes followed me all the way back to my desk. I sat down heavily as I picked up the pen again. The tapping was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I stared at the paperwork in front of me, the words swimming on the page. I told myself to focus, to finish the shift, but the unease in my stomach refused to be ignored. The morning light filtered through the narrow windows of the break room. I sat at the small, square table, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The events of the night before replayed in my mind. The tapping, the silence, the presence. My fingers tightened around the ceramic. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that weight again, those unseen eyes boring into me. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled me from my thoughts. I looked up just as Mr. Hargrove entered the room, his movements brisk and deliberate. He was carrying a clipboard, scanning the papers clipped to it. He crossed to the counter and poured himself a cup of coffee, the faint clink of the glass pot breaking the quiet. "Mr. Hargrove," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. He paused, the coffee pot hovering mid-air, before setting it back down with a deliberate motion. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Miss Clara?" I stood, the chair scraping faintly against the tiled floor. "I need to know what's in Unit 7. His eyes narrowed slightly, though his face remained otherwise impassive. He set the clipboard down on the counter and folded his hands neatly in front of him. "I trust you followed protocol last night?" "I did," I said, my voice steady. "I checked the lock 3 times, just like you said. But something..." Something was there. I heard tapping. And after it stopped, I hesitated. I felt something watching me. He regarded me for a long moment, his gaze unflinching. Then with a faint sigh, he picked up his coffee and took a slow sip. "It's not what's in the unit," he said finally, his voice low and deliberate, "but what the unit keeps out." The words hung in the air between us. I stared at him, waiting for him to elaborate, but he said nothing more. "What does that mean?" I demanded. "What is it keeping out? Why all the secrecy?" He set his coffee down with a faint clink. "You've been given all the information you need to do your job, Miss Clara. I suggest you focus on that." "That's not an answer," I said. "I deserve to know what I'm dealing with." His faint smile returned. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing in a place like this." I opened my mouth to argue, but he raised a hand, cutting me off. "You've done well so far. Don't let your imagination get the better of you." With that, he picked up his clipboard and turned to leave, his footsteps echoing faintly as he disappeared down the hallway. I stood there for a moment, the weight of his words settling uneasily. It wasn't what was in the unit, but what it kept out. The phrase repeated itself in my mind, a riddle with no answer. In the weeks that followed, the strange occurrences began to escalate. At first it was subtle, small things I could almost dismiss as my imagination. The whispers came first, faint and distant, like the murmur of a conversation just out of earshot. I told myself it was the sound of the building settling, the creak and groan of old pipes in the quiet. But the whispers persisted, growing louder and more distinct, though I could never make out the words. Then there were the objects. Tools I knew I'd left neatly arranged on the embalming room table would be scattered when I returned. Doors I'd locked and double-checked would be found ajar, their hinges creaking faintly in the still air. Once I returned to the break room to find my coffee mug moved to the center of the table, though I was certain I'd left it by the sink. The air grew colder, the chill seeping into my bones no matter how many layers I wore, and always there was that feeling, that oppressive weight of unseen eyes following me wherever I went. It was worst at night, when the silence of the building felt too deep, too absolute. I took to humming softly under my breath as I worked, the sound a small comfort against the suffocating quiet. I thought about quitting more than once. The idea of handing in my keys and walking away from Blackthorn Memorial Facility was tempting in its simplicity, but every time I considered it, something held me back. Maybe it was my refusal to let fear drive me away. Or maybe it was something else, a gnawing curiosity that refused to be silenced. The strange occurrences weren't random. I began to notice patterns, subtle but undeniable. The whispers always seemed to come from the same direction, leading me toward the cold storage units. The objects that moved always ended up closer to Unit 7, as though drawn to it by some unseen force. Even the air itself seemed to shift, growing colder the nearer I got to that heavy steel door. One night, as I stood in the hallway outside Unit 7, the cold air brushing against my skin, I made a decision. I wasn't going to quit. Not yet. Whatever was happening here, whatever the building was trying to communicate, I needed to understand it, even if it meant facing the darkness behind that door. A few nights after the unsettling events at Unit 7, the flashlight beam wavered slightly as I tightened my grip, the cold metal biting into my palm. The hallway stretched out before me, its fluorescent lights flickering faintly. I stood there, just outside Unit 7, the air heavy and still. The silence pressed in, thick and oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the cooling units. I turned away from the door, forcing myself to move, to focus on the tasks that still needed doing. My boots echoed softly against the polished floor as I made my way down the corridor. The stillness of the building felt different tonight, sharper somehow, as though it was watching me more closely than before. I was halfway to the embalming room when I heard it, a faint sound, like the shuffle of footsteps. I froze. The sound came again, soft but deliberate, the unmistakable rhythm of someone walking. I turned, the flashlight beam cutting through the dimness. The hallway behind me was empty, the shadows undisturbed. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast, empty space. No response, just the faint hum of the lights overhead and the distant whir of machinery. I took a cautious step forward, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. Someone was here. I turned the corner, and that's when I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the hallway, silhouetted against the faint glow of an emergency exit sign. His posture was unnervingly still, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. As I raised the flashlight, the beam caught his face, gaunt and pale, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to cut through the darkness. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice steadier than I felt. He tilted his head slightly, as though considering the question. Then with a faint smile, he took a step closer. The movement was slow and deliberate, and I fought the urge to back away. "My name is Victor," he said, his voice low and smooth. "I used to work here, a long time ago." I stared at him. There had been no mention of a Victor in any of the files I'd seen, no indication that anyone else had access to the building. "You shouldn't be here," I said, my grip tightening on the flashlight. "This facility is closed to the public." Victor's smile widened slightly. "I'm not the public," he said. "I'm checking on things." "Checking on things," I repeated. "What things?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another step forward, his movements unnervingly calm. "You've noticed it, haven't you?" he said, his tone almost conversational. "The way this place feels at night, the way it breathes." I swallowed hard. "What are you talking about?" Victor's gaze seemed to pierce straight through me. "The dead don't always rest," he said, his voice soft but deliberate. "Some linger, caught between worlds, and this place, it's a beacon for them." A chill ran down my spine, and I took a step back without meaning to. "What do you mean, a beacon?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned his head slightly, as though listening to something I couldn't hear. The silence stretched between us. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost a whisper. "You felt it, haven't you? The whispers, the cold, the eyes." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. He was right. I had felt it. Every night, the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. The whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Hearing him say it out loud made it feel more real, more dangerous. "What do you know about Unit 7? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Victor's expression shifted slightly. "Unit 7, he repeated almost to himself. "That's where it's strongest. The boundary." "The boundary?" I pressed, taking a cautious step forward. "What boundary? What's in there?" He looked at me then, his piercing blue eyes locking onto mine. "It's not what's in there," he said. "It's what it keeps out." My stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" I demanded, my voice rising slightly. "What is it keeping out?" Victor's faint smile returned, but there was no warmth in it. "Curiosity," he said, his tone almost amused, "is a dangerous thing." I took another step forward, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "You're not answering my questions. And you're asking the wrong ones," he replied, his voice calm and infuriatingly cryptic. "You should be asking yourself why you're still here, why you haven't walked away." I opened my mouth to argue, but before I could speak he turned, his movements impossibly smooth. The shadows seemed to swallow him as he walked away, his figure growing fainter with each step. I raised the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, but he was gone. The hallway was empty. I turned slowly, my footsteps echoing faintly as I made my way back down the hallway. The building felt different, heavier, as though it had shifted in some imperceptible way. Only the memory of Victor's piercing blue eyes and his cryptic warnings lingered, etched into my thoughts like a scar. Later that same night, the memory of that incessant tapping still clung to me as I moved on to my next task. The flashlight felt heavier in my hand as I made my way down the hallway, the faint hum of the cooling units filling the silence. The building felt different tonight, more oppressive, as though the walls themselves were leaning in, listening. I tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to me like a second skin. I had just finished wiping down the embalming room table when the crash shattered the stillness. It was loud, metallic and final, echoing through the halls. I froze, the rag slipping from my hand and landing with a wet slap on the floor. For a moment I couldn't move. Then the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. I grabbed the flashlight, my fingers trembling as I switched it on. The beam wavered as I stepped into the hallway, the sound of my boots against the polished floor too loud in the suffocating quiet. The crash had come from the direction of the cold storage room. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself forward, each step slower than the last. The door to the cold storage room loomed ahead, slightly ajar. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly overhead, their hum uneven. I reached the door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. The air here was colder, biting against my skin even through my jacket. I pushed the door open. The flashlight's beam swept across the room, catching the gleam of steel tables and the dull sheen of the storage units. The door to Unit 7 was wide open, swinging slightly on its hinges. The lock hung from the chain, broken, the metal twisted as though it had been wrenched apart by something impossibly strong. I stepped closer, the beam of the flashlight trembling as it illuminated the empty interior of Unit 7. The body that had been stored there was gone. The cold air from the unit spilled out, wrapping around me like a shroud. This wasn't possible. The lock had been secure. I had checked it. 3 times, always 3. A faint sound broke through the silence, a soft creak that sent a jolt of fear through me. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the room, but there was nothing there. Just the empty tables, the sterile walls, and the faint hum of the cooling units. My breathing was shallow as I forced myself to move, to search. I stepped back into the hallway, my footsteps echoing as I moved toward the embalming room. The air felt heavier with each step. The flashlight's beam wavered as I reached the door, my hand shaking as I pushed it open. The embalming room was dim, the overhead lights casting long shadows across the walls. My eyes were immediately drawn to the table in the center of the room. The body was there. It was sitting upright on the table, its pale, lifeless form stark against the gleaming steel. The sheet that had covered it was crumpled at its feet, and its eyes, once closed, were now wide open, staring blankly ahead. My flashlight beam caught the glassy sheen of its gaze, unblinking and fixed on some unseen point in the distance. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the floor, my body frozen. My breath came in shallow gasps, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. The body's mouth moved, the motion slow and deliberate, as though it were trying to speak. No sound came, just the faint, wet click of its lips parting and closing. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. And yet, the body sat there, its lifeless eyes staring, its mouth moving in that slow, unnatural rhythm. A faint sound behind me broke through the haze of terror, a soft shuffle, barely audible. I felt the air shift, the unmistakable presence of someone standing close. Too close. I turned slowly, the flashlight beam cutting through the dimness. Victor stood there, his tall frame half hidden in the shadows, his piercing blue eyes locked onto mine, his expression grim. "You've seen it now," he said, his voice low and steady. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The weight of his words settled over me as the cold air pressed in from all sides. Later that same night, the cold air pressed against my skin as Victor's words hung in the silence. The chaos of earlier still echoed in my mind, the broken lock at Unit 7, the reanimated body's unnatural movements. But now the embalming room was quiet, almost deceptively so. I had barely had a moment to process it all, and yet here I was, standing in the dim light with Victor, the weight of what was to come pressing down on me. My breath came shallow, my chest tight, as I turned my gaze back to the body on the table. Its lifeless eyes stared ahead, unseeing, but its presence felt anything but inert. The faint, wet sound of its lips parting and closing still echoed in my ears, unnatural and wrong. I shivered, the memory of its earlier movements sending a fresh wave of unease through me. Victor stepped closer, his movements deliberate, his figure cutting through the dim light, like a shadow given form. I wanted to speak, to demand answers, but my throat felt dry, my voice caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. He stopped a few feet away, his piercing blue eyes fixed on me. "This place," he began, his voice low and steady, "is not what it seems. It never has been." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look at him, though my hands trembled at my sides. "What are you talking about?" My voice was barely above a whisper. Victor's gaze shifted briefly to the body on the table before returning to me. Blackthorn was built on a site where the veil between the living and the dead is thin, too thin. The energy here, it draws them, the ones who can't let go. I shook my head. "The ones who can't let go," I repeated. "What does that even mean?" "The dead," he said simply. "Some cross over. Most do. But there are others. Spirits trapped by pain, by anger, by unfinished business. They linger, caught between worlds. And this place, it calls to them." The room felt colder now, the chill biting into my skin despite the layers I wore. I glanced at the body again, its stillness somehow more unsettling than its earlier movements. "And Unit 7? I asked, my voice firmer now. "What does it have to do with this?" Victor's expression darkened. "Unit 7 is a boundary, a barrier. It holds the ones who are too far gone, the ones who can't be reasoned with. It keeps them from slipping through." "Slipping through to where?" I demanded. "What are you saying?" He stepped closer. "To us," he said softly. "To the living." The words hit me. I looked at him, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of cruel joke. But his expression was unflinching, his eyes steady. "Why didn't anyone tell me this?" I asked. "Why didn't Mr. Hargrove? Because he thought you'd leave," Victor interrupted. "Most people would. But you're still here, aren't you?" I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught. He was right. I was still here despite everything. Despite the whispers, the tapping, the oppressive weight of unseen eyes. I had stayed. Victor's gaze softened slightly, though his expression remained serious. "You're not just here to care for the dead, Clara. You're here to guide them." "Guide them?" I echoed, the word foreign and strange on my tongue. "I don't understand." He gestured toward the body on the table. "That spirit," he said, his voice quieter now, "is trapped. It's clinging to this world, to whatever pain or regret it couldn't let go of in life. If we don't help it cross over, it will linger. And the longer it stays, the stronger it becomes. Strong enough to break through." "Break through to what?" "To us," he said again, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "To the living." The room seemed to close in around me, the air heavier, colder. I looked at the body, its lifeless form somehow more menacing now. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Victor reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a thin, black candle, a small vial of oil, and a piece of chalk worn down to a nub. "We perform the ritual," he said simply. "It's the only way to help the spirit move on." I stared at the objects. "A ritual?" I asked. "What kind of ritual?" "One that's been used for centuries," he said, his tone calm but firm. "It's not complicated, but it requires focus and belief." I hesitated, the weight of his words settling over me. I forced myself to nod. "Okay," I said finally, my voice steadier than I expected. "What do I need to do?" He handed me the chalk and gestured toward the floor. "We need to draw the symbols, a circle first, then the sigils. I'll guide you." My hands trembled as I knelt on the cold tiled floor, the chalk feeling foreign in my grip. Victor crouched beside me, his movements precise as he directed me. The circle came first, its edges uneven but unbroken. Then the sigils, intricate looping shapes that seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't explain. When the symbols were complete, Victor placed the candle at the center of the circle and lit it with a match. The flame flickered, casting long dancing shadows across the walls. He uncorked the vial of oil and handed it to me. "Anoint the body," he said. "Forehead, hands, and feet." I hesitated, the weight of the task pressing down on me. I dipped my fingers into the oil, the liquid cool and slick, and touched it to the body's forehead. Then its hands, then its feet. Each movement felt deliberate, ritualistic. Victor began to chant, his voice low and rhythmic. He gestured for me to join him, and I stumbled over the unfamiliar syllables at first, my voice shaky and uneven. But as the chant continued, something shifted. The air grew heavier, charged with an energy that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the room. The body began to change. the glassy eyes softened, the tension in its lifeless form easing. A faint, almost imperceptible glow surrounded it, growing brighter with each repetition of the chant. The room felt warmer now, the oppressive chill replaced by a sense of calm. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The glow faded, the body still and lifeless once more. The air felt lighter, the weight that had pressed down on me for so long finally lifting. I sat back on my heels as I stared at the body. It looked peaceful, at rest. Victor extinguished the candle, his movements deliberate and precise. He turned to me. "You did well," he said simply. I didn't respond. My hands trembled as I set the chalk down, the faint residue of it clinging to my fingers. The room was silent now, calm and serene. As I stood, my legs unsteady beneath me, the gravity of my new responsibilities settled over me like a weight. The danger, the uncertainty, it was all real. And I knew I couldn't walk away. Not now, not ever. Several weeks later, on a quiet night shift, I found myself settling into the strange rhythm of my new reality. Blackthorn Memorial Facility had become more than just a workplace. It was a threshold where the lines between the living and the dead blurred. Victor's visits had grown less frequent, his lessons fewer but more pointed. He would appear without warning, his gaunt frame emerging from the shadows, his piercing blue eyes filled with an intensity that left no room for doubt. Each time he left me with new knowledge, new rituals, new truths about the spirits that lingered here. "You'll know when a spirit is restless," he had said during one of his last visits. "The signs are subtle, but they'll call to you if you're listening. Trust yourself, Clara. You have everything you need." His words stayed with me, echoing in my mind even when he was gone. I had learned to feel the shifts in the air, to hear the whispers that seemed to rise from nowhere, to follow the faint pull that guided me toward the spirits in need. It was exhausting, draining in every possible way, but it also gave me something I had never had before: purpose. The whispers began that night as I was scrubbing down the embalming room table, the sharp scent of disinfectant filling the air. At first they were barely audible, just a faint hum beneath the steady drone of the cooling units. But as I listened, they grew louder, more urgent, until they were impossible to ignore. I set the rag down as I straightened. The air seemed to shift, the temperature dropping sharply as though the room itself was exhaling. I knew this feeling. I had been waiting for it. I stepped out into the hallway, the chill biting against my skin. The whispers surrounded me, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Closing my eyes, I focused on the sound, letting it guide me. When I opened them again, I knew where to go. Unit 7. The hallway leading to the unit was darker than usual, the overhead lights flickering faintly. My footsteps echoed softly against the tiled floor as I approached the door. When I reached the door, I hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. The viewing room beyond was dimly lit, the faint glow of the emergency exit sign casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The whispers grew louder as I stepped inside, their tone insistent but still unintelligible. The air was colder here, the chill seeping into my bones. I scanned the room, my gaze falling on the small wooden chair in the far corner. It seemed out of place, its presence almost too ordinary in the oppressive atmosphere of the room. But I felt the pull, faint but unmistakable, drawing me toward it. I took a deep breath, forcing my legs to move. The whispers stopped abruptly as I approached, leaving the room in silence. I knelt on the floor, pulling the chalk from my pocket with trembling fingers. Victor's lessons echoed in my mind, his voice steady and calm as he walked me through the rituals. But this time I was alone. The symbols came to me easily now, their shapes familiar and precise. I drew the circle first, its edges smooth and unbroken, then the sigils, each one humming faintly with energy as I completed it. The tension in the room seemed to build with each stroke of the chalk, the air vibrating around me. When the circle was complete, I placed the black candle at its center and lit it with a match. The flame flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. I uncorked the vial of oil and anointed the chair, my movements slow and deliberate. Forehead, hands, feet, Even without a body, the ritual remained the same. The whispers returned as I began to chant, their tone softer now, almost pleading. The words felt foreign on my tongue, their rhythm strange and uneven, but they came more easily with each repetition. The air grew warmer as the energy in the room shifted. The shadows in the corner seemed to coalesce, taking on a faint, shimmering form. It was a woman, her figure translucent and flickering like a flame. Her face was etched with sorrow, her eyes wide and searching. She reached out, her hand trembling as though she were afraid to touch the edge of the circle. "It's okay," I said softly. "You can let go now." Her gaze met mine, and in that moment I felt the depth of her pain, the grief, the regret, the longing that had bound her here. The light around her grew brighter, the edges of her form softening as the energy in the room shifted again. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The light faded, the air growing still and calm. The room felt lighter now, the oppressive weight replaced by a sense of peace. I sat back on my heels, staring at the empty chair. Exhaustion hit me all at once, a bone-deep weariness that left me trembling. But beneath it there was something else, a quiet sense of accomplishment, of purpose. I had done it, on my own. As I stood, my legs unsteady beneath me, I felt a faint warmth in the air. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. I turned toward the door and stepped out into the hallway. The whispers were gone now, the shadows still, and for the first time in weeks the silence felt like peace. The silence of Blackthorn Memorial Facility had changed over time. Weeks had passed since the last of the rituals, since the chaos that had threatened to unbalance everything. In that time, the oppressive weight of this place had softened, reshaped itself into something almost reverent. The faint hum of the cooling units and the occasional creak of the old building were no longer unsettling. They had become familiar, part of the rhythm of this place, my place. I walked down the hallway, the soles of my boots tapping softly against the polished floor. The air was cool, carrying with it a stillness that felt like calm rather than foreboding. The fluorescent lights above me flickered faintly, their glow casting long shadows along the walls, shadows that no longer seemed to watch me. They simply were. The whispers began as I passed the embalming room. They were faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustle of leaves stirred by a distant breeze. I paused, tilting my head slightly, listening. They weren't pleading this time. There was no urgency, no desperation. Instead, they were soft, warm, like a quiet thank you, spoken in a language I couldn't quite understand. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over me. It wasn't unsettling anymore. It was comforting. When I opened my eyes, the hallway stretched before me, empty and still. I continued walking, my steps steady, my breathing even. The whispers followed me, growing quieter as I moved further from the embalming room. They didn't cling to me like they used to. They simply lingered, a gentle reminder of the work I had done. I passed the viewing rooms, their doors closed, the faint scent of disinfectant lingering in the air. The memories of my first days here felt distant now. I wasn't the same person who had walked through these halls for the first time. Time and experience had changed me. This place had changed me. The whispers faded entirely as I approached Unit 7. The air here was colder, but it no longer made me shiver. It was a familiar cold, one I had come to expect. The heavy steel door loomed ahead. The lock was secure, the chain taut, just as it should be. I stopped in front of it, my fingers brushing against the keys in my pocket out of habit. I reached out and touched the lock, the cold metal smooth beneath my fingertips. I didn't need to check it, I knew it was secure, but the act of touching it felt important, grounding, a small ritual of my own. The whispers didn't return, but the air around me felt warm for just a moment, like a hand resting lightly on my shoulder. I closed my eyes, letting the sensation settle over me before it faded. When I opened my eyes again, the hallway was just as it had been, quiet, still, waiting. I stepped back from the door, my hand falling to my side. I turned and began walking back down the hallway, my steps steady. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly overhead, their hum blending with the quiet sounds of the building. Blackthorn Memorial Facility was still a place of shadows and whispers, of cold air and heavy silences. But it was no longer a place of fear. Not for me. It was a place of healing, of closure, of purpose. It was a place where the living and the dead found peace, and it was my home. As I walked through the halls, I felt it, the sense of belonging I had been searching for without even realizing it. The whispers might return, and the shadows might shift, but I would be here. I would be ready. This was where I was meant to be. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole.